So I need a little bit of a shift to a more orangey tone. I've just mixed up some cad yellow and cad red, some white, just for this this branch. Sort of the portion of it that's in light. And seeing as I have it, I'll kind of work it all the way down that edge. Otherwise, everything else I've mixed up has been quite greenish. So if you find your brushes getting so difficult to work with because it seems a bit dirty or anything like that, just give it a clean. Especially if you're working with these small brushes, it's very easy to wipe them off. I'm just about there with enough detail on this left-hand set of leaves as well. As I say, I don't want to go too far with detail just because we want the right balance between how much is detailed in the skull and how much is detailed in these leaves. So at this point, I am going to clean my palette off like we did last week because I've used most of the space for these green mixtures, but I don't want too much of the green going into my skull colors. Well, any of the green really, I would say, going into the skull colors. So yeah, I'll give that a good clean, give my brushes a clean before beginning with the skull forms, which is going to take us through definitely to the break, and then a good portion of the first chunk of the next session as well. We're going to try to bring the skull to sort of a complete finish that we're happy with before going back and sort of making minor adjustments to everything else, as I say, dark accents and light accents and so forth. Just one thing I remembered I wanted to do up here with this leaf. I wanted a little bit more of a transition in the dark portion of the leaf, so that it feels light is filtering through in a just slightly gradated way, because there's this sort of sense of light shining through the leaf, and it's expressed in the lighter portion of the leaf. There wasn't as much variation in the darker bit, so I just want to get that to work a little bit better. Yeah, so that's working better now. I'm happy with that. Yes, that's pretty good. So what I'm going to do is clean off my palette. So give it a bit of a scrape and then a wipe. And a little bit of a clean as well. And also just give those brushes a bit of a clean, which won't take long because they're tiny. For instance, can start to look for, this isn't too bad in terms of detail, maybe some slight softening of some edges, which I'll be talking about. I can exaggerate some of the shadows or add a bit more color into the shadows. But then particularly things like these little notches of detail, I can start to render a little bit more specifically. The sort of sealing of the skull forms, the bone forms, we want some of that to be suggested. This is crucial with this one to have those forms in. If you're working from the girl's face, then it's things like we really want to refine the ridging in the hair, things like the eyes, these more complex little transitions from dark to light, those sorts of things. The shadows cast on the face by that flower. And if you're working with the skull, the human skull, then we've got lots of detail to work in here. So we've got all the teeth that we'd want to be rendered out, the various texturing through the cracks in the skull, and a lot of stuff going on there. Pock marks, we've got these sort of tiny little notes of sort of pock marks, those sorts of textures, which we have a little bit of with the deer skull as well. The deer skull is actually quite smooth generally, but there are some little bits and pieces of texture that we can work on. So in terms of pigments, we're going to be using, again, the same mixtures. So if you think about what you were using last week, I think I was primarily using sort of burnt umber, black and white, with little touches of cad yellow and red mixed in, a little bit of yellow ochre here and there. You might want to use a slightly bigger brush, so I'll probably be using, as well as my smaller brushes, I'll be using this slightly bigger round. And primarily, again, I'm going to be working sort of left to right just to make sure that they don't smudge too much. I'm trying to just make sure anything that's down here where my hand is my hand doesn't go back and forth too much. Also tilt my camera down a bit. Swivel it. And zoom in just so you can focus in on the work I'm doing on the skull. That's pretty good. And just dim my light a little bit. So you should be able to just see the highlight in the skull there. I don't want it to blow out too much. That's going to mean the shadows are going to recede a little bit for you, but you should have a bit better look into the lighter forms of the skull. So I'm going to start up top. So this area here, and starting to turn the skull forms out of these shadows. So I want a little bit more of a soft penumbra as the light forms of the skull emerge. Don't want it to be quite as sharp, so I'm just putting in a little bit more of a transition. So similar to the leaves, I'm just focusing in my attentions on a smaller area at this stage. So that's all we really mean by detail work. It's not that distinct. We're just applying the same principles to smaller and smaller areas. Got a little bit too much green mixed into my white, so I'm just going to dab a little bit of white out as well. If you do find you've got some sort of colors like green mixed into your lighter tones of your brushes, you can just use a little bit of your CAD red. Will sort of neutralize that as a complementary. So you can always have that as a little trick up your sleeve. So all these tones I'm using are essentially greys, but they shift between sort of black, white, burnt umber, sort of very, very neutral greys. And then occasionally with more sort of red or yellow mixed in, but generally they're sort of shifting around a kind of grey point. We're not going, nothing can be really super high chroma in something like a white form. But you can have shifts of hue, so you can shift from like a reddish grey to a yellow grey to a blue grey. So if you observe any of those sorts of changes, like some parts of your reference will look more bluish, you can play that up. It often works well to do that. Creates a bit more of a kind of interesting visual. And being that it's color, it's also a bit more versatile, so you don't have to worry too much about, you know, it being exactly the right. Like, it doesn't really matter if it's a yellow, kind of like a warm yellow gray or a red gray in a particular area generally. But it is good to have those variations. So you can sort of do them as you feel works best. So whatever looks best to you. But you do want to bear in mind, generally you want things to go sort of higher chroma as they get lighter. So try to stick with sort of lower chroma, so less saturated grays in the darker portions or the darker halftones. Then as we start to move towards this sort of like the central section, we want that to have more of the high chroma colors like cad yellow, cad reds mixed in is your ideal. So as things go lighter, they also start to go higher chroma, more saturated. So if I'm doing this lightest portion of the skull, I can just take little dabs of yellow and red, mix them in with white, and then use that for these really bright sections. So I'm at a point now where I want to start laying some of these finer textures over the surface, which I'll just start doing before we break. And then I'll carry on with when we get back. So using the smaller brush, I don't necessarily want to go super dark with these textures. They'll kind of go a bit too black. If you blur your eyes, it kind of gives you an idea of what value you want these sorts of things to be. And you just want to sort of think a bit about how your brush work, or the movement of your brush, sort of suggests these forms. So it doesn't have to be a continuous line. I can leave it sort of broken, which is more how we view it. So we sort of see it as a slightly broken line. Some places it's a bit darker than others. As it gets near the center, it starts to sort of cluster together a little bit more. And it can also start to get a bit darker once it reaches those portions. So maybe reach down a little bit more there. So as it starts to sort of enter the more shadowy regions of the skull, it can go a bit darker. And when it re-emerges back out into the lights, it can go sort of lighter again. But as I say, I don't have to kind of paint the whole thing in. Just give a suggestion of it. Smudged my green slightly on the left there, which is okay. I'm just going to wipe that back, and then we'll be revisiting those darks with some glazing later anyway. But it's something I need to be careful of. And I'll be developing these sort of crack forms a bit as when we get back and as I'm sort of progressing, but I just want them sort of roughly mapped in at this stage. It's got these ones up top as well. Yes, that's most, I think, of those little cracks I've got mapped in now. As I say, they're just sort of mapping them in, not necessarily adjusting them at this stage. We'll be going back and we've got a good while left to tweak them. But I just wanted them sort of noted, their placements. Yeah, so that's 4. So we'll have a break now. I'll leave my video up running so that you guys can take a look at it as you're working if you want to carry on during the break. I do recommend taking a break just because it's good to sort of clear your head a bit before coming back. But yeah, so you should have got up to a point where hopefully you've got most of your sort of foliage or flowers and those sorts of things blocked in. Starting to work on the skull form or the girl's face. And particularly sort of, as I say, having all the sort of major little points of detail mapped, and then we'll start to render them in the next session. So we'll have a couple of hours. So probably about an hour and a half working on, maybe a bit more than an hour and a half working on the skull forms. And then about a half an hour or so, 20 minutes, just finalizing all the dark note and any of the light highlights that we just want to bump up a bit. And then we'll be able to call it a day, and I'll do a sort of a bit of a recap. But yeah, I'll see you guys at past. Have a nice break if you take one. But otherwise, I'll see you soon.